We probably should have made this video like 3 years ago.
Our gaze is shifted upwards to the sky.
Welcome back, Goblins, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Dylan, and I am an alter in the Aether system. This is a channel about dissociative identity disorder. But what does that mean? What's this disorder? What does it mean to have it? At first, when we created this channel, we were like, there's plenty of coverage on this topic, but there hasn't really been a video that was quite what we would have wanted to make with it yet. Also, our channel has grown a bit over the past couple years, and there are some people who are new to this topic entirely. We want to make sure that there are as few confused people as we can, so here's our version of what is D.I.D. All of our sources can be found in the description. Follow the proof of D.I.D/OSDD link to a Google Doc where you will find at least 45 trustworthy sources. There's also a list of triggers in the description that this video may contain. Just in case you're among those who experience triggers more frequently, we put the list all in one spot in the description so we don't have to scatter the warnings throughout the video. Dissociative Identity Disorder, not dissociative identity disorder. Some people use these terms interchangeably even though they don't mean the same thing. To disassociate is to remove oneself from association with something, like a business, while dissociation refers to the mental process of disconnecting from one's mind and body. To remember that, we remind ourselves there is no ass in dissociation, and we're designing stickers that say that. Back in 1994, multiple personality disorder was changed to dissociative identity disorder. They're not two different things. They're one disorder whose old outdated name is still clung to by society. Let's break down the name dissociative identity disorder and define it a little bit more clearly. Dissociative means to dissociate from one's self and surroundings. A dissociative identity would be someone who disconnects from one's identity. And the disorder part means that it carries the 4 characteristics required by psychology to classify something as a disorder. If you've taken any psych classes, you may have heard of the 4 Ds. Deviance, distress, dysfunction, and danger. Not danger as in harming other people, danger as in potential danger to self. Not inherent. So to put it all together, this is a disorder where you disconnect from your identity in a disordered fashion. I'm now going to clarify that this disorder does not make someone dangerous. One of the first things that many people ask is whether or not the other identities are dangerous. They're not. They might hurt your feelings depending on which one you talk to, but that's pretty much the extent of it. People with D.I.D. are just as likely to be dangerous as your average Joe. And from what we've seen and witnessed personally, people with D.I.D. are more likely to become the victim in future abusive situations. Since many people with D.I.D. grew up with abusive situations, they may see that as some form of safety and then accidentally find themselves returning to that kind of situation. And that's not necessarily on purpose either. It can be a subconscious kind of thing. The dissociation part is just as much a part of this disorder as the alters, which we'll get to in a second. And since this disorder initially starts due to a child dissociating away from traumatic situations, the name multiple personality disorder seemed to leave out a lot. And that's why they renamed it. They wanted to take into account the aspect of disconnecting from oneself and dissociating rather than just focusing on the alters entirely. For those academics among us, I will now include the DSM diagnostic criteria for D.I.D. as of the DSM-5, the current edition. A. The disruption of identity characterized by 2 or more distinct personality states which may be described in some cultures as an experience of possession. The disruption of marked discontinuity in sense of self and sense of agency, accompanied by related alterations in affect, behavior, consciousness, memory, perception, cognition, and/or sensory motor functioning. These signs and symptoms may be observed by others or reported by the individual. B. Recurrent gaps in the recall of everyday events, important personal information, and/or traumatic events that are inconsistent with ordinary forgetting. C. The symptoms cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. D. The disturbance is not a normal part of a broadly accepted cultural or religious practice. Note, in children, the symptoms are not better explained by imaginary playmates or other fantasy play. E. The symptoms are not attributable to the physiological effects of a substance, e.g., blackouts or chaotic behavior during alcohol intoxication, or another medical condition, e.g., complex partial seizures. Link to that is also in the description or the Google Doc, one or the other. You'll find it. And that's how the DSM-5 defines D.I.D. We fit every one of these descriptions way too well. I came here to have a good time, and honestly I'm feeling so attacked right now. But yeah, to further clarify, this is a trauma-based disorder. On the PTSD spectrum, it's the next step past CPTSD, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. D.I.D. is essentially an extremely severe form of PTSD. There are some who believe that they were born this way, while in reality, we all are to some extent. Around 9 to 10 is when our identities solidify and become one cognizant being. We all have somewhat separated parts of self as children, and they naturally fuse together as you grow up. If severe trauma occurs during childhood, it prevents these parts from fusing together naturally. There are barriers of amnesia that grow between parts, and these parts act independently from each other. And that's called the theory of structural dissociation. Now for the part that most focus on with D.I.D., the alters. Alters are one of the main symptoms of this disorder. Alter is short for alternate identity states, the personalities aspect of it all. They may also be referred to as parts, others, personalities, selves, or whatever feels most comfortable to the system. A system is a group of alters in a body, a way to refer to the collective whole. Like someone with D.I.D. is a system, or someone with OSDD is a system, and we'll define OSDD in a minute as well. Alters are created when a child's brain essentially sections itself off to protect itself from severe trauma. Trauma can range from natural disasters, car accidents, medical procedures, and types of assault. And trauma is subjective, like this meme. So what is traumatizing to some may not be for others. No two people will have the same set of alters, not even identical twins. Everyone with D.I.D. has gone through different traumas, and therefore their systems will look different. And there is not a limit on how many alters you can have. The criteria is 2 or more distinct identities, not 2 to 100. There's literally someone who commented on one of our TikToks saying that the brain physically can't hold more than 100 alters, to which we were like, but what about these thousands of systems we've seen reporting over 100 alters? And the documented case of a woman with 2,500. Because that's real. Link to the documentary is in the description and that Google Doc. And the alters can hold many different roles as well. Some of the most common being host, protector, child alter, persecutor, trauma holder, gatekeeper, and internal self-helper. The roles are pretty self-explanatory too, which is pretty nice. Though we do plan to do another video where we explain alter roles in more depth. Because they're not limited to the few that we just listed, those are just a few. And some alters can even hold roles that are only relevant to their own system. For example, if someone deals with some chronic physical illness along with their D.I.D., sometimes there will be an alter who is better able to function during the flare-ups of their chronic illness, or is the one that holds more of the symptoms and kind of shields the other alters from that. Like, that's definitely a thing we've seen around. And there are a couple different types of alters, like roles and types are different things. There's the roles that they hold, and there's the types, that is ANP versus EP. ANP stands for apparently normal part, and EP stands for emotional part. The apparently normal parts are the ones that, you'd see as the more ones that function in the day-to-day life, like the hosts or co-hosts, while the EPs are something more along the lines of the trauma holders. Alters may have their own names, ages, sexualities, genders, likes and dislikes, memories, and even backstories. They can be as distinct as 2 regular people you'd see walking down the street. They could also be very difficult to distinguish from each other with very few differences. And both kinds are equally as valid. And alters don't have to be human either. We've seen many cases of alters being mythical creatures or even animals. It really depends on what the individual has gone through. And just to make things clearer, in D.I.D. the alters are not just someone pretending to be someone else in order to cope. It's very involuntary. And it's not a fun disorder to have. We may have the occasional fun video here and there, but that's certainly not the norm. It can feel like you're just a passenger in your own life, being carried around by people you can't even see. Oftentimes it feels like you're living a stranger's life and you're about to lose grip of it at any second, and who knows when the next time you're gonna be back, you know? The struggle is real. But quite often there is more than one alter in control of the body at a time. That is called co-consciousness, and it goes very unnoticed until someone realizes they have D.I.D. and consciously starts looking for the inconsistencies. Sometimes one alter will speak while the other controls the body, or sometimes more than one alter will be trying to do things, which will look like someone with D.I.D. trying to multitask, but sometimes there's more going on under the surface. There's also the phenomenon of there being no one in front, or not being able to tell who you are. That can and does happen. This disorder is not just clean-cut switches from one distinct identity to the next. That's not how it works. Half the time if you ask us who's out, we'll say we don't know, because we don't know, because it's really not always clearly defined who's out. Switching alters is also something that will look different for every case. Sometimes it'll be as seamless as a blink or a slight pause, but sometimes it can basically make you faint. A switch during a stressful time will be different than a switch during peaceful times. There is far too much policing over what switches can and can't look like on the internet these days. Which is ridiculous because that's like telling people how to yawn or saying that they're yawning wrong. You switch how you switch. Circling back to the topic of trauma, the natural question that comes up is what causes D.I.D.? What trauma can be so severe that it makes a child's brain section itself off and essentially split apart? And again, there's no specific way to get D.I.D. besides being severely traumatized before the age of 9. And yes, we did experience trauma. We experienced severe child abuse starting around the age of 3. But that's way too heavy to go to in this video, though. That's for another day. Most often it results from cases of sexual abuse like assault, exploitation, or molestation. But like we said earlier, it can also result from things like car crashes, natural disasters, religious abuse, physical abuse, wars, like if you were a child living in a war zone, neglect, kidnapping, or severe emotional abuse from a young age. Yes, it doesn't have to be like inherently physical abuse either. And it may sound like some of these things aren't very serious or aren't very scary, but look at it from a small child's point of view. Anything severe enough to make them feel as though they need to escape, with the only escape being their head, is enough to cause D.I.D. The concept of whether or not something was traumatic enough doesn't matter. If it was traumatic to the individual, then it was traumatic to the individual. And it's very common, if not always, that one has other mental disorders if one has D.I.D. That's called comorbidity. D.I.D. often comes with depression, anxiety, PTSD, eating disorders, panic disorders, and others. And self-harm is very common in people with D.I.D. Many times you'll hear people say that it's easier to deal with physical pain than emotional pain, and they turn to that sort of thing as a coping mechanism, even though that's very unhealthy. I say to myself as well. And this is a very serious disorder. The rate of suicide attempts in people with D.I.D. is 70%, and we're not excluded from that either. And we've seen and known people and lost them to their D.I.D. as well. Just recently there was a loss of a prominent system on TikTok due to the failure of the mental health system. And we were friends with another system who was lost about 6 years ago, which we forget about a lot because we dissociate that one away. We have lost people to their D.I.D., and that is no joke. This is a serious disorder. It's also worth mentioning that D.I.D. is not the same thing as schizophrenia. You can even have both of them at the same time because they're two different things. It's not super common, but we've seen quite a few cases of that during our time in online support groups. There can be schizoaffective symptoms along with the dissociative ones, which can lead to a misdiagnosis if someone has both symptoms. Many people with D.I.D. are accidentally misdiagnosed with schizophrenia before they receive the proper D.I.D. diagnosis. and the misdiagnosis rate with DID is maddening. Usually, DID patients spend roughly 6 years in the medical system before receiving the proper diagnosis. Like, I think we started therapy when we were about 11, got diagnosed with DID when we were 19. That's a while. Yeah, that's a while. Now, onto the topic of whether or not there is a cure for DID, or a way to get rid of it. There's quite a few ways to heal, but no true way to get rid of it. Dissociation and segmentation is how your brain learned to function and grew up that way. So it's pretty hard to make your brain stop doing that. The two most common paths of healing are functional multiplicity or final fusion. Functional multiplicity is where one learns to function as a system through internal communication, working through amnesia barriers, therapy, compromise and coexistence, and you just go about life as a system and hopefully learn to manage symptoms better over time. Final fusion is the merging of all of the alters into one entity. A lot of people feel like it's similar to killing all the alters off, but it's not. It's more like simultaneously existing together as one being, if that makes sense. And there's also partial fusion, which is what we're striving for, and that is when some, but not all, of the alters have fused in order to work better as a collective. Like, some of us have very large numbers of alters due to going through very severe things, and sometimes it's easier to tell where everyone is when there are less fragments around. So we are aiming for less than what we have. Because if I'm being honest here, if I'm counting fragments, we started out with about 1,500. And that's a gigantic number. That's very difficult to manage. We could barely feel where our brain was at all for a minute there. And it was just a bunch of holograms basically taking up space in the inner world. And that's not a good way to function. That's just not a good way to function. Now, there is a difference between integration and fusion as well. That is another thing that's very oftentimes and easily confused. Integration is the breaking down of amnesic barriers and sharing of memories between alters, which increases communication and functionality. And fusion is when two or more alters become one alter, merging together, and most of the time the memories do get shared between the two. Like a fusion, it kind of brings all of the aspects of both of those alters together, so you kind of have to be careful about who's fusing together, because if it's one heavily disordered alter with another heavily disordered alter, it may not work out very well, or it may work out very well. It can be kind of unpredictable. Speaking from experience, speaking from extensive experience, you don't have to fuse if you have DID though. That's not like what you have to do. Like, not the next step, like, oh, I have DID, let's fuse it. That's not what you have to do. Unless that's what you want to. And if that's so, then frickin' go for it. More power to you, because that takes a lot of strength. Recovery at all takes a lot of strength. And we're so proud of how far we've seen a lot of people come over the years. Now, medications can help with symptoms and comorbidities, but there's not a specific medication for DID. I can't wait to see if something like that is ever invented, because that'd be totally cool. We're probably not going to take it because we prefer to personally take as few chemicals as we can, but we know a bunch of other people with DID who would be all over that stuff. Some medications may make it harder to switch, but there isn't a medication specifically for suppressing alters either. Everyone has a different body chemistry as well, which is why there are different types of medications like antidepressants, which is why Lexapro made it way harder to switch for us, but other systems we've met have had no problems with that at all. Meds will affect systems differently. The ones most commonly seen used with DID though are antidepressants, anti-anxiety meds, and antipsychotics. We're on one of each. Now, where do the alters go when they're not in control of the body? A place called an inner world. And some people don't even have an inner world. It can be just like a black void or nothingness. You don't have to have an inner world if you have DID. Like, a lot of people get caught up on that, but don't trip out, bro. It's good. Yeah, it can range from a black void of nothingness to a small solar system and beyond. The most common types we've seen, though, are like a house, a mansion, or a small town or city. Alters can interact with each other in the inner worlds, and it can be just as real as an outer world person-to-person interaction. Our inner world personally drastically changed over the last couple of years. It went from some planets and land masses floating out in space to a ring of land with a planet in the center and a few floating islands attached to the ring. We'll make a separate video about that too, because these things get surreal. It's not just a normal place for your alters to live, it's your brain's interpretation of what is going to fit these alters best. And we have a lot of alters who are very prone to disagreeing with each other, to say the least. And they would not function well if there was only one house. We needed more room than that, so, yeah. We don't have a house. Our house was a mountain when we started out, like, we painted it. This is what we started out with, and I have yet to draw what we ended up with. Stay tuned for that. I'm not just some uneducated youngster out for clout. That's a mistake many people have been making about us. Researching D.I.D. is something that we've been doing since we started becoming aware of our own symptoms back in 2011. One may say it's a special interest of ours. We want to help others like us because we know how scary and daunting this can be. Our light tones should never be mistaken as us not taking things seriously. We may be mistaken for some cheerful trender, but that's certainly not the case. We speak the way that we do so people won't be afraid if they've been diagnosed. We don't want others to lose hope, because there's always hope for recovery. This can be a terrifying disorder to have. And rather than being like, yeah, you should be afraid, we want people to live life as fully as they can. We want to spread love, hope, knowledge, and happiness with our channel. Not fear-mongering. And yes, there are other disorders where you can have alters. There's also OSDD, which is Other Specified Dissociative Disorder. And a new classification, I think they're calling it partial D.I.D. There's a link to that in the description. I haven't been able to read that enough to recap it good enough to make 2 little paragraphs for this video. So I'm gonna just put that link in the description for you guys. Yeah, that was just recently adjusted in 2020, so don't worry if you haven't heard about that adjustment yet. But partial D.I.D. really does describe it pretty good, because there are 2 main types of OSDD, OSDD 1A and OSDD 1B. OSDD 1A is when it's like D.I.D. but there's less distinction between alters, and then OSDD 1B is like D.I.D. but with less amnesic barriers between alters. Both are pretty much D.I.D. but just missing a couple of the points for a complete D.I.D. diagnosis. But yes, we're including the link to that new partial D.I.D. thing by the ISSTD in the description, so please check that out if you want to learn more, because we're going to be rereading that too, because that's pretty interesting. Anyway, that seems like it briefly covers most of the topics about dissociative identity disorder. Hopefully this puts some of your questions at ease, or maybe it raised more questions. Either way, our comment section is always open for questions, even if they seem silly. We firmly believe that no one is born with all of the knowledge and that there are no dumb questions. People have to learn things from somewhere, and we're happy to include answers to questions in our future videos. If you enjoyed this video or want to see more of our content, please leave a like or comment, subscribe to become a goblin, and join the Gob Squad. Don't forget to check the links in the description because there are a ton of resources on D.I.D. in there. Also a link to a conference on D.I.D. that is taking place in Orlando in February. We're gonna be there. Check it out. It's awesome. And also our other social medias are in that description. We're on TikTok and Instagram if that interests anyone. Thank you for tuning in. Take care of yourselves, love yourselves, and we will see you all in the next video. Yes, we are planning on redoing most of our informational videos, especially the one about our diagnosis, since details are very treasured to some of our viewers, we're gonna get ourselves diagnosed a second time. So we're gonna have to remake that video regardless. Later.